Hello, I'm Eric Endlick, and we are here today to talk about neurodiversity and mental health in college. Thank you so much for joining us. We have a great panel of folks from the college side, from support programs, as well as the students. So I think it's going to be a really interesting conversation. Some of the topics that we're going to cover are the interconnections between neurodiversity or learning differences and mental health in college students, how they impact each other, advice for IECs on how we can guide parents, things that IECs should know about support services that are available to college students, perhaps how you can encourage students to be receptive to help, as well as some insights and advice from college students. So from a college student. So looking forward to diving in. Let's introduce ourselves briefly. Again, I'm Eric Endlick. I'm with Top College Consultants. I'm an IEC working with neurodiverse students nationwide. I'm located in the Boston area. Kelsey?
My name is Kelsey Bolke. I am in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm a licensed professional counselor and a certified rehabilitation counselor. I'm currently the assistant director for accessible education at Agnes Scott College, but up until about 2 months ago, I was working at the Emory Autism Center at Emory University as a counselor. So I spent pretty much my entire adult career supporting autistic young adults with a greater and greater emphasis in the past couple years, specifically working with and supporting autistic college students.
Great. John?
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Conway. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I work with Edge Advance, which is a young adult transitional living program located in the heart of Chicago that works with neurotypical and neurodiverse students, typically those attending college or looking for other post-secondary options. And we provide support, coaching, academic services to help them be successful. So happy to be here.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alex Morris-Wood. I'm the Director of Transition Services and Outreach at Beacon College in Leesburg, Florida, which is a four-year college catering to students who have diagnosed learning differences, predominantly ADHD, dyslexia, and autism spectrum disorders. My background's in mental health counseling. Here I oversee all of our transition to college programs, including Navigator Prep, which is the country's first and only virtual transition to college programs for students and parents as we get them ready for life after high school.
Thanks, Alex. Amy?
I am Amy Radoshansky. I'm the Vice President of Programming at the College Living Experience. We work in supporting individuals with neurodiversity as they attend higher education, be it college or community college, other settings, and into the career and workplace. I've been working with students with autism spectrum disorders for all of my career in K-12 education, but have been specifically at CLE since 2008 and had an opportunity to work with many students in supporting them in their higher education journey.
Thanks, Amy. And Hunter?
My name is Hunter White, and I am a senior psychology student at Dean College, located in Franklin, Massachusetts. I'm a college student on the autism spectrum, and I have received special services pretty much throughout my educational career. And I look forward to talking a little bit more about those experiences on today's panel.
Great. Thanks, everyone. And I think I may have forgotten to mention that I'm also a clinical psychologist, hence my interest in mental health, as well as being neurodivergent myself. So let's start with a question that I think would be appropriate for Kelsey and Alex, being in college setting. You talk a little bit about, either of you can start, the interplay between learning differences and mental health. How do learning differences impact the management of conditions like anxiety and depression? Are there ways in which neurodivergence makes it easier or harder for students to cope with these issues? And I know that the causality can sort of run in both directions. Being on the spectrum, can raise your risk of anxiety, for example. So.
Well, I guess I'll start, sure. As we know, there is such a high comorbidity between different learning disabilities, autism spectrum disorders, and psychiatric issues, whether that be anxiety, depression, trauma, or stressor-related issues. And what I see typically in, in the transition, which is really my focus, is that many students are not aware of their mental health prior to entry. A lot of times the areas that would have caused a lot of stress, whether that is the academic areas because of executive functioning deficits, have been removed. A lot of those barriers were removed before college, whether that's because of an IEP process, a 504 plan, or a lot of specialized LD schools. So when they enter college and then all of a sudden these new stressors have been placed to them that tax a lot of those deficits, whether that is reading comprehension issues, written expression, long-term planning. All of a sudden there is this, resurgence of anxiety or stress that might be really foreign. So I think it is really common that we see that, and it's usually heightened in the very first couple of weeks. Where these students, though, are a little more prepared than their counterparts is they've been used to self-advocating for their needs. Whether or not they could specifically label a deficit area, whether or not they could identify that this is the causation of my stress, they do have a comfort with reaching out for support. So for a lot of students here at Beacon, what I see is they might go to their learning specialist because they just know something is not working for them. And through active collaboration, they can create a problem-solving plan, which again is a huge executive functioning skill, so that we can really mitigate, is this coming from a LD kind of window, or is this coming more from a mental health component, and then figuring out the appropriate services after that.
Great.
Yeah, I would agree with a lot of what Alex said. Something that stuck out to me and something that I was thinking about is how sometimes being neurodivergent or having autism can be almost a protective factor for some of these folks. And it's a very individualized situation. For some, it's a protective factor. Like Alex was saying, not worrying about reaching out for support. They're not concerned about social stigma affiliated with that. They're ready to advocate for themselves. Whereas I've seen other students on the spectrum, dealing with mental health challenges and autism or other neurodivergence can, be less of a protective factor and sort of exacerbate one another, Eric, like you were mentioning, and just, thinking about all of these things are super individualized. So it's important to think about, the individual that you're working with and sort of what are their opinions and feelings about how to seek services and that sort of thing. And, thinking also about with mental health and autism specifically, there are a lot of things related to autism that can create mental health challenges in others. If someone's really looking to make friends, but they're having significant challenges with that due to just not sure how, there's a lot less structure and support for socialization in college, right? So if you're not as confident in those social skills, that can lead to higher levels of anxiety, that can lead to higher levels of depression, and then those can come back around and exacerbate things you would typically affiliate with autism. So they're just so interconnected with one another, and always keeping that in mind. Typically, more diagnoses means more complexity rather than less.
Thanks, Kelsey. Anybody want to add anything on this topic before we go on to another topic?
Well, I think just quickly what Kelsey said was really interesting, that for a lot of students on the spectrum, it is hard to know where the root kind of problem is coming from. Is this a social thinking error, or is it a social motivation or anxiety component? So I think the more we try to encourage rapport development in the very beginning, it will provide a lot of support service people at colleges the opportunity to kind of dissect where root causation is happening. But again, for me, it also comes back to informing the student prior to entry. The more empowered the student is, the more transparent we can be around, it is okay that you have a mental health diagnosis. We work really hard to destigmatize neurodiversity. We need to do the same thing with mental health so that, both can kind of equally be treated in a college environment.
Thanks. All right. So I have a question for John and Amy in particular about the transition to college. So one of the reasons I went into this field, becoming a consultant, was as a therapist. I had seen students go off to college and really have some very negative outcomes, becoming depressed in their first year and not even making it through the first year in some cases. And I think if students are properly prepared and supported in that transition before, during, after, they can have better outcomes in college. So as consultants, what do you think we should be advising parents? How can we kind of guide parents for the best possible mental health outcomes in college, or not just parents, but families? How should we be kind of directing these families so they can make that transition as smoothly as possible?
Yeah, that's a great question, Eric. And I think Alex and Kelsey teed it up pretty well in terms of that advocacy piece. I mean, we spend a lot of time in our program, and I know Amy and other folks here do as well, working with our students on advocating. And many of the young adults that we get, at least, or we see, tend to be those students who do end up either needing some additional help and wanting that before or while they're starting off school at maybe as a part-time basis. Or unfortunately, maybe they have gone off and tried it on their own and weren't as successful. And really, that's where they mostly need the help with us. Unlike, I think, some of the students that Alex was referring to who come in with a lot of those self-advocating skills, the students we tend to see that their anxiety overtakes the ability for them to advocate for themselves, and it really creates that struggle. So for parents and family members, really teaching the students how to do that advocating, maybe signing them up for a college readiness program the summer before, or taking it. Alex, I know, has got a great program. I know CLE's got a program. We have a summer program. It's becoming more and more critical, I think, to teach these skills and help them advocate. And then during campus visits or dropping them off, really sort of making those connections, introducing them to the counseling department, to the accommodations department, and making sure that they have those connections and know where to go and who to call. And then most important, probably backing away, right? Then giving it over to the professionals and the student and advocating for them and helping them learn those skills and stepping in when they need to, but also giving them a chance to learn that on their own.
Yeah, thanks, John, for starting that off. And I think that one of the things I encourage people to think about and consultants to think about is, because there's not a mental health issue presently, it doesn't mean one will not emerge. Alex touched on this, is that these stressors have sometimes been removed, and then when you flood them all back in, you start to see that challenging term, Eric, that you're talking about, or the year-long struggle. And it becomes really difficult to pinpoint which behaviors and observations you need to be concerned about. And so starting the conversation, John touched on touring the campus and checking in on mental health services. Everyone should do that. Everyone should know where on campus you go when you feel flooded, overwhelmed, have anxious thoughts. So that's one thing, is like build some awareness that this is actually a very common issue for all individuals in higher education at this time. Building the self-awareness. So advocacy is one thing, but the awareness, where do my stressors lie? How can I communicate about them? Who are the people in my support network? And as education consultants, I think the role really is, how do you evaluate the environment and what's around them? And what's around them can be people, can be places, can be things that they need to adequately get support. So take that step to plan through the environment and like the mental health supports. Is that going to be something that's continuous from where you were at home and continue on while you're at college, or are you finding someone new? That's a big discussion to weigh the pros and cons of. And I think some of you might have some other thoughts on that. And then, all the other things, living supports, social integration. Kelsey talked about, like, what are the social supports there that can help you? So education consultants really like evaluating the whole environment and where the needs are. You'd rather start off with a little bit more and fade it back than have that really messy transition that's very hard to recover from.
Great, thanks, Amy. Hunter, I'm wondering if you have anything to add. Since you're a senior, you obviously made the transition to college successfully. Advice for students or families, to, because that transition can sometimes be incredibly stressful and things to set up or keep in mind to successfully transition?
Yeah, I think first off, I agree with pretty much everything that's been said so far, especially with what John said. When you take, if parents want to take their students, or not their students, their kids on campus tours, I think the campus tours are really important. I mean, everyone does them, autism or not. But I think when looking at colleges, it's not only important to look at, it's very important to look at like what support services are specifically offered, because at every college the level of support varies a little bit. Some colleges offer more support than others. I mean, all colleges do. So I think that's one component to really be aware of. But I think counseling, like counseling centers, I think that's really important in having college students talk to counselors before they make their decision on where to go to, and get to know the counselors more. So that way, if they find someone that they're really comfortable with, they can base their final decision of where to go to college off of that, for example. From my personal experiences, I mean, I've struggled with anxiety on and off throughout my life, and I was actually seeing a therapist before going to college. And a lot of the things that we talked about was counseling centers at colleges. I mean, all colleges have a counseling center, but what's the best way to be supported while going to college? Because if you do go to especially 4-year college and live away from home for the first time, there's really no avoiding the transition. Like the anxiety, there's going to be uncertainty, anxiety there. There's no avoiding it, and it's going to be stressful, especially first semester freshman year. Like when I first transitioned to college back in 2017, I ended up seeing a counselor there my first semester, and that was really helpful for my transition because I could sort of grow more comfortable with being on my own for the first time, which is a challenge. And I think that was one thing that really helped me transition to college, and I was able to get more involved. I was able to gain more confidence, and I was able to do more on my own because I sort of realized what my own strengths were. And I think a lot of students that go off to college, they really learn who they are when they're at college, not in high school or before, because college is the first time to really explore who you are. People decide what they want to major in, for example. People learn what their strengths and weaknesses really are. Like I learned a lot of my own strengths and weaknesses my freshman year of college. Like, for example, I learned I was really good at writing, and test taking I learned I wasn't so great at. And I realized that's okay. That's a struggle that I've had to deal with, but I've developed techniques to help me sort of overcome that barrier. I mean, there's always going to be the learning challenge regardless. It doesn't go away going to college, but gaining an awareness of what the student really needs and being able to self-advocate really helps things become much more manageable. So I think there's really a lot to consider, but I think addressing mental health just as much as addressing neurodiversity and autism is equally important, and everything should be considered. There's really a lot to be considered, and it's a lot of work, but I think it's all worth it in the end, for sure.
Those are all excellent points, Hunter. Thank you. I certainly talk to families about the emotional readiness, not just the other aspects of college readiness, but students should know, what things are you vulnerable to under stress? Are you likely to become anxious, depressed? Are you going to fall into addictive patterns with a substance or some kind of electronic device? And then know, what are the red flags that you're starting to go in that direction, and have a plan in place in advance. Okay, if I start getting depressed after I go to college, here's all the things that usually help me. Maybe it's exercise, maybe it's talking to your family, maybe it's listening to music, going for a walk, maybe it's getting back into therapy, going back on medication. Having sort of a multi-point plan and knowing where the resources are in college. And for families, I think a lot of their information comes from admissions. They go to informational sessions put on by admissions, and the admissions says, hey, we have free mental health counseling available. We have accommodations if your student has learning differences, and families take that in and it sounds great. But it's important, and I think you kind of alluded to this, Hunter, to sort of go the extra mile. What does that mean, free counseling? How many sessions? Who's delivering the counseling? Is there a wait list for the counseling? Really kind of try to go a little deeper so you know really what are the differences between College A and College B. Yes, they both provide counseling, but is it really equivalent? So on that note, another question for Alex and Kelsey about support service in college. What do you see as being the most, the services that make the most difference? And how can consultants and families kind of evaluate the quality of the services in college so that families can make appropriate choices and IECs can make appropriate recommendations? Kelsey?
I can start. So, you know, to your point, Eric, that it's so individualized based on the college, right? You know, everyone has these same supports available, you know, accommodations, counseling. I would take a look at which schools go above and beyond. You know, college autism support programs are becoming much more popular, where colleges have specific programs to support students on the spectrum. They often, you know, include mentoring, and it's just more wraparound supports. Because another thing to think about is sometimes if there's not an owner of all of these different things, you know, if someone's getting accommodations, they're going to counseling, they're meeting with an academic advisor. If there's not a central person that's making sure everyone is talking to each other and everyone's on the same page, even though they're accessing a ton of support, stuff still can fall through the cracks. So that's something else to take into consideration too, is how are programs talking to each other and working together to really support the student on all fronts, and how are programs thinking about transferring that care to the student so the student can learn how to sort of manage their lives and make sure everyone's in communication. Because, you know, I found a lot of times even colleges that have these autism support programs, once the student has figured out like how to be a student and they're like, yes, I've got this, I'm good, it's like time to graduate. And then you have to figure out how to apply for jobs and how to be a coworker and be in the workplace environment, which is another skill set that has to be learned too. So that's something else I would look at when you're looking at college. What sorts of supports are there, thinking about not only the transition into college, but what does the transition out of college look like? So, you know, those are a couple things. And I just want to underscore that I think one of the biggest barriers to accessing supports in college is executive dysfunction. So these supports are there, but like we've already touched on, students have to seek them out themselves typically, and it's not always an easy process. It's usually not a straightforward process. There's usually like 100 different people involved that you need to reach out to, and it can be very challenging to stay organized and on top of all the different processes you have to go through. Just to access like 3 different supports, you may have to talk to 12 different people. So I definitely think that is one of the biggest barriers to being able to access supports in colleges and universities. So it would be worthwhile to talk through and think through, you know, what supports are offered to students to help them navigate that process.
Great, thank you. You mentioned autism support programs. For anybody who doesn't know, I have an extensive list of autism support programs on my website, topcollegeconsultants.com. And of course, I include Beacon and Dean. Alex, did you want to say anything on this topic?
Yeah, I mean, I think between Kelsey and you, Eric, you guys bring up a lot of important information, and it's really about the details. I think so often families get told about services through admissions and through marketing and through the website, and there's buzzwords that everybody uses that to somebody that's not in the special education world is really attractive. Coaching, one-on-one mentoring, individual consultations. I mean, these are buzzwords that everybody uses, which can mean a lot of different things. So asking really specific questions about who is actually giving the service. So if you have a student with dyslexia or dysgraphia and they need to go to a writing center, who's providing that service? As Kelsey said, are they speaking to disability services. I read an article in Forbes magazine that said silos will be the death of college campuses. And for students who learn differently, that is so true, because so often disability offices, mental health offices, career services, academic, not everybody talks. So it's really important. I always try to have people look at who's delivering the service, how frequently is the service available, and who's implementing the service. Is it built into a program, or does the student have to self-schedule? My favorite is when a student with executive functioning issues has to be able to schedule all of their own academic coaching. And it's kind of ironic when you have to kind of plan, prioritize, and think flexibly around getting the support in that area. And then you want to look at how long those services are provided. A lot of, as Kelsey said, a lot of colleges are offering these first-year programs. Well, I just gave it away. They're for first-year students only. And over time, you're supposed to be scaffolded away from that. And there is no hard assessment if a student is ready for independence, or what happens if the student needs more services. So it's really about asking a lot of questions. Do you have counseling for more than 6 sessions a semester? And if not, what's their option? Is there a counselor nearby? Unfortunately, students with learning differences typically have to create their own separate team at a college, even with services, because they rely so much on accessibility services when they cannot be everything. You cannot rely on the person giving you accommodations to be your mentor, your tutor, your life coach, and your counselor. It's just not realistic.
Great, thanks, Alex. So let's go back to Amy and John and talk about the role of parents. As you know, as IECs, we interface with parents as well as students, and we want to set appropriate expectations. I'm a special needs parent myself. I know how easy it is to be sort of extremely involved in the process and sort of overprotective of your child, especially if they're going away from home for an extended time, maybe for the first time in their lives. What is the role of parents in this process and transition, and how can we be advising parents sort of exactly where they should step in or step back?
This is a tricky one, John. I'll start, and please jump in too. Parents have so much to learn here. And this is a space of transition for them to be understanding the higher education systems. They might have understood it once when they were attending college, but now it's different. There are so many more systems or silos, as Alex is talking about, that impact their students. And they also have to think about it in this lens of through someone with who is neurodiverse, and some of them may or may not have that personal experience to understand how that impacts them. So understanding what higher education systems are and laws and regulations is the first thing. We are continuously seeing parents that don't understand some of the things that we're very familiar with in this group, which is you can't contact professors. We have parents that are still trying to access professors in the same way that they were in high school. And I think sometimes something as basic as that is not said, and parents have to understand that. And no one's having those overt conversations about how their relationship with the school systems change in this new space. So understanding that the feedback loop is going to be very different. It's going to be very delayed, and there will be discomfort with that and understanding that. Things like, of course, IEPs, we know IEPs and 504s are not in place. How can parents start to step back from the IEP and 504 process and that ownership of that, so that their students can step up and be learning to own that, so that they're already starting that parent shift in relationship of, I'm here to coach or embrace my new space as a parent with their relationship with their child, so that their son or daughter can step up a little bit and they get to find that relief. Maybe finding some of that discomfort before they leave home of not owning things will help them once they step into the higher ed system. In some of the support programs that you'll see on campuses, Kelsey touched on them, that, you will have people accessible to parents or reporting mechanisms that go out to parents. They all look a little different. if that's something that you have a parent who will not be able to let go of that type of contact, then that needs to be a part of the planning too. What kind of feedback loop the parent needs, what kind of supports the parent should have, be it training, parent coaching, progress reporting. Those are all things that, depending on the tier and type of program support that you're accessing for your son or daughter in higher ed, are available. But they're very different models, and you'll have to listen very astutely to what their barriers are, when they're accessible and when they're not.
Yeah, great points, Amy. And I agree with everything you said. And I would just highlight maybe 2 points. The one about the need or the benefit of parents having someone to be able to speak to, both inside and out of the college itself. So whether that's a liaison, someone that can sort of manage some of those expectations and questions so that the parents aren't inappropriately or reaching over into trying to contact professors or folks like that really, in a sense, deny the student the opportunity to advocate for themselves. And yet these are parents who have been doing this for probably many, many years, and all of a sudden the door is shut, right? So having that parent coach or someone outside, whether it's an IEC or a certified parent coach, or even working with a program like ours that provides parent coaching, to really allow that outlet to have those questions answered and to voice those frustrations and to problem solve in a way that hopefully empowers the student and doesn't necessarily disempower them by continuing to create that dynamic where the parent comes in and rescues, and the student then therefore feels good about the problem being solved, but they haven't learned how to solve the problem themselves, which is going to be a long-term disaster, quite frankly. So.
Really quickly, I think it's also part of it is that colleges don't have the same information available like high schools do. And so I think part of what I've learned in working with parents in this transition is to provide them not just like an overview psychoeducationally of the legal changes, but also the reality that we don't see students to the magnitude that you think we do on a day-to-day basis. At Beacon, I think we do a really great job with such a small college, but we're not going to be able to tell you every detail of a day. And sometimes it's providing parents with a little more information about what information we actually receive as a college. And even, I work very closely with College Living Experience. What they receive on a day-to-day basis is not the same. So even if we could provide the information, a lot of times we don't get it. So I think we need to go be outside of just what's the difference between IDEA and ADA and talk about just the realities of how documentation and reporting works on a college campus.
Alex, I'm glad you said that because, well, for example, at CLE is working with Navigator Prep to help prepare families, and it does go beyond, hey, here's IDEA and ADA, and then in addition, let's talk about day to day. What the scope of a day looks like. And I think it's so important to have that picture painted for parents. And so parent training programs, parent education programs about the realities of higher ed and what that looks like, what free time looks like, what choice can mean for students is important to get that picture of. So yeah, we lean on Navigator Prep too to help prepare families because it's so important. It's such a critical part.
And really recognizing when the student and or the family system does need more. I mean, there are, as we've talked about multiple times in this session, there are limits to what, and appropriate limits to what colleges can provide and should provide. And that's when I think utilizing the IECs and program people and relationships that we have with many of the same people on this call, right? That, we're in contact with each other because we're often getting students from those schools or sending them to those schools. And so it's important to have those open lines of communication, but really recognizing both as a student and for the parent when you've sort of hit that limit or that wall, and then appropriately looking at other resources that the student needs for their benefit with the hope of getting them back to that school at some point in the future.
Thank you. One last question. This one is for Hunter. It's about the college admissions process. Then I'm going to put our contact information up and stop so we can get some great live Q&A going. So Hunter, consultants listening to this talk work with students on the college admissions process, and wasn't that long ago for you that you were applying to college. You probably remember it can be anxiety producing, stressful with all the uncertainty and the deadlines, and even more so for students with learning differences or executive function challenges, making those deadlines, having to figure out what to write your essay about. And as consultants, we're working with students, coaching them through the process. What advice do you have for consultants to work with students as effectively as possible and manage that stress so that the process is, good for their mental health and doesn't, become overly taxing for them?
I think that's an excellent question, and I think my best advice first off would be for consultants is to get to know the student, because every student that has a learning difference, everyone is different, just like everyone without learning differences is different. Every student that has a learning difference, their learning difference affects them differently. Like they may have different strengths and weaknesses. They may have trouble with reading comprehension. They may have trouble with writing. They may have trouble with both or one or the other, vice versa. So I think it's very important for consultants to know what their students' strengths and weaknesses are. And I think another piece of advice I would add is that the college admission process, it's going to be stressful no matter what, but there are ways to make it more manageable. I think one very important skill is to be able to plan ahead, especially with the deadlines, and they do come faster than we anticipate. And I know this a lot from my own experience. I'm a college student. I have deadlines all the time. They come very fast. We think we have a lot of time, but we really don't. So planning ahead, get started on the process early. So most high school students tour colleges around junior year. Maybe for students that have learning differences, maybe they should start the college process a little bit earlier. Maybe they should get started maybe freshman or sophomore year of high school, maybe sophomore year of high school for students with learning differences. So that way they can plan ahead more, because with the college process, there's going to be more planning involved. There's going to be more search involved. So, from my own experiences, I took a gap year after high school. And part of that was because I didn't start looking at colleges until very late junior year, beginning of senior year. So I started my own college process late. And part of that was because I wasn't always sure if I was going to be able to handle college. I knew, for one thing, I always wanted to go to college, but because of my learning difference, I wasn't sure if college was going to be the best option for me. And it turned out that it was. So yeah, plan ahead well, take them on campus tours. I would say have a list of maybe 5 to 10 colleges that offer supports in counseling, academic support, but have really strong resources, and have like a whole list of colleges, because if you just have one or two, it's not going to be enough. I didn't look at too many colleges. I think I looked at maybe 4 or 5, because there wasn't a lot of colleges that had support programs, but I ended up finding one that worked for me, which was Dean College. They offered everything that I wanted. They had a great campus. They had great supports. They even had sports teams. I participate on the cross-country team, and I'm now a co-captain. So I think it's also important to look at colleges that have very diverse clubs and extracurriculars, that have all kinds of clubs, whether that's sports or maybe a theater program or any kind of clubs that plans activities on campus. I'm part of a student activities club on campus as well. So I think diversity is a big thing, but there are so many to look for with colleges. So, I could go on and on, but I think my general advice is plan ahead, get to know the students, and maybe help the students understand themselves better, their own learning background better, because once they go off to college, they're going to really need to know themselves well, because if they don't, it's going to spark up a bunch of anxiety and depression. And there's going to be probably a little bit of anxiety and depression going into college, but having as little as possible, will help students gain self-confidence. And really, I think having self-confidence really helps a lot in success, because if you're self-confident, you think you can do anything, and you put your mind to it, and you're going to be more successful. But if you don't have self-confidence, it's going to be a lot harder.
Thank you. So I am going to put our contact information up here. So we're going to stop momentarily and be available for the rest of the hour for live Q&A. I want to thank all the panelists for joining us. This has been a great conversation, and we look forward to all of your questions. So since this is a recording, you can pause the screen and see the contact information, and we will see you shortly.